And so the topic is KOL life cycles, the art and science of choosing which KOLs to work with. Obviously, there's a lot of qualitative aspects that go into deciding which KOLs work for your brand, when there's fit and alignment on content. And I wanted to take a different perspective, since there are many marketers here and with different needs, just taking a more visual, data-driven angle to it. So starting off, a very common question we get asked is, should I work with top-tier KOLs, people with over several 100,000 or 1 million followers or more, or do I work with grassroots influencers? And so there's something we'll go into. And how can you actually work with KOLs in a scalable, ongoing way, right, to help them create value in their content? So I'm just starting with a very, actually, financial standard disclaimer. Past performance does not guarantee future results. So a little background on me. I actually started out in finance. I went to Wharton before I delved into the world of digital marketing. And so my perspective in this space is from a very completely different lens. 6 years ago, when I moved from New York to Shanghai, I started a blog. I was actually a wannabe KOL, specifically covering shopping recommendations, the best at Taobao, what to buy in China, discovering independent designers in the country. And what I did was actually, let's get back, I'm sorry. I was actually trying to build my own following and actually networking and meeting other bloggers and influencers and KOLs during this process. So this is how the journey of Parkloo started, was actually from a personal journey of trying to figure out, where do I find my followers and fans? And when you think about it, we did a survey with about over 100 KOLs online, and we asked them, how long have you been doing this? Many of them have been doing this for years. And for some, it started as a part-time, maybe while they're at school or while their job, and then became a full-time thing once they could actually have an ongoing steady flow of campaign and collaborations. So it's amazing to think now, when you think with the advent of live streaming, but before that, it was on BBS forums, very traditional blogs, and now every time there's a new platform, KOLs jump to wherever the audience is. So the real journey is finding the KOLs before they peak. And one of the projects we did when Parkloo was a blog was actually work with ShopBop, which is owned by Amazon, one of the largest multi-brand fashion e-commerce companies globally. They were very early on in working in this game, and we were helping them collaborate on content with anywhere from 30 to 50 KOLs a month on a regular basis. So over a span of over 2-3 years, it was literally hundreds of KOLs that they had worked with on content. So that kind of drives some of the perspective we do today, which Parkloo is now a KOL marketing platform, which you can ask about later. So we see the world in 3 tiers, and we actually exclude celebrity in the conversation of KOL. So celebrity being someone where they have their audience from other media, whether it's like TV, movies, etc. We're talking about everyday people who have built credibility based on a content niche that they have are continually building up on their platforms. So here's a question. Everyone has a limited budget, right? So celebrity can be 10x, multitude X more than KOL, and how do you distribute that? If you have 100, do you put that all in one top tier KOL, or do you distribute that across hundreds of smaller KOLs? So here's just an example here. We often talk about celebrity live streaming in the case of Angela Baby, where she sold 10,000 lipsticks over an hour. Again, it's a very different reach and aspect when you talk about someone like Maggie, who may have, maybe it's 1 million as opposed to tens of millions. Okay, so we'll just go through one example where we were working with an accessories brand, new to China, only been around for about 1 year. And they decided to go through a very aggressive KOL strategy where they did product seeding as well as sponsored posts with over 1,000 KOLs. This spanned across at least 3 platforms. So there was WeChat, Weibo, they even did Nice, and then even some Youku as well. And so what did we find? I don't know how this works. So the top tier KOLs were engaged in a very deep strategy where they actually Some of them actually took a trip to the brand headquarters. They created very extensive WeChat content. And what was amazing is, although 90% of KOL engagements are probably on building brand awareness and reach, this particular brand was actually looking to track conversion. So I take this extreme example, even though I know that most KOL marketing is done for branding instead of performance, to really kind of take an isolated example to see how does this work, right? In the case for the top tier KOLs, they literally generated sales that more than paid for the cost of the engagement within 24, 40, 72 hours of them making the post. Now, in these cases, again, very high value content, right? It wasn't something that was overly commercial. It wasn't something that the brand created. It was very much what the KOL created. And in the case for the micro KOLs, where you had over 1,000, you sort of saw this like 80-20 rule, where 20% of them actually drove conversion and generated sales. The question is why? Why was it only 20%? Was it because the customer journey was very complicated? Was it because the content wasn't high value enough? And it becomes, this is where we started looking at the KOLs themselves and into the data. So here is an example of I would say, top 10 fashion WeChat account. This is her engagement over time, or her total monthly views on WeChat. So she might have made one post every day, or one post every day for a period, and then how many views over time. So the yellow trend line is, it can go any way. It can go up, it can go flat, right, or it can go down, right? And if you start looking at a lot of KOL, I would actually guess if you adjusted the month of January, which has Chinese New Year, and sometimes there's less posting activity during that period, you could potentially see that this curve continues to grow, right? And the best performance and ROI is actually before the KOL peaks, right? Because if they peak, they have already standard rates of what they're charging per post. But actually, their audience may be actually in a phase of less engagement. So this is a really interesting thing to consider, especially as a marketer, because you're like, oh, well, we heard that this KOL is amazing, we should work with them. But maybe that was 6 months ago, right? So having a longer term perspective, as opposed to just seeing today how many followers and how much engagement do they have right now, but having a time-based perspective on that. This is the same KOL on Weibo. Right? So this very much follows the pattern. Here's a question. What is my investment in Weibo versus WeChat? And it really depends also on the KOL's audience at that point. This KOL would have been great to work with in sort of more 2014 on Weibo, right? So oftentimes, because we don't have data readily available, we're just looking at the sheer numbers now, which in this case would be over 2 million followers. So it's not to say that Weibo can't be effective, but in this example, this KOL might be better on WeChat. So then we're like, well, why is it that the micro KOLs aren't converting as much in sales? Is it it's just not enough numbers? Is it, is that because the content was created by them, but in a more, I would say less deep way, where they were just given the product and told to take some photos? So we started analyzing the WeChat views by the minute. And that sounds crazy, because usually you just see like how many views one post gets. And actually charting it over time, right? And unfortunately in China, it's quite easy to game the system. You can go in Taobao and you can be like, I would like to have 2,000 WeChat views from the period of like 2 p.m. to like 6 p.m., right? And so this is something that we realized is actually quite murky, particularly when you're working with smaller numbers. It's a lot harder to be like, okay, I would like 2 million views on WeChat versus, okay, I just like a couple thousand. So this is something we realized that data verification is really important, especially when you're working at the grassroots level. And just to show this example, there's basically no activity that's happening between sort of key viewing hours. So it's kind of in the morning time, commute time, between 9 o'clock or so in the morning, and there's a huge spike, and then it dies off again. So it's really making sure that when you're working with KOLs in mass, at scale, that you have the data to make the right decisions. Okay, So I think Elijah and Maggie touched on this very well. It is very much the content that matters. But then being able to choose from literally the thousands of KOLs, having the data at your fingertips to do that. And so if you think about it, in this brand's case, if they had known out of the 1,000 KOLs they did the seeding, that these 200 were the ones that they could focus on, right? It would have saved them a lot of efforts. So then you're like, well, maybe I should just invest all my resources in top-tier KOLs, right? And I think some people have mentioned this notion of exclusivity, like some brands working exclusively and not having them cover competitors. I think the hard part is the KOL has to maintain their credibility. So unless your brand represents many brands, like many beauty products in this example, it would be hard for them to generate interesting content all the time if they were just covering the same handful of brands. So I think the other thing to consider is that it becomes a value of performance versus budget, right? So as KOLs literally change their cost every month, right, month to month, there's an increase. If their fan base is growing, it becomes difficult as a marketer to repeat them on an ongoing basis. So there's always the demand for new KOLs, fresh KOLs, and given that KOLs have this say 4 or 5, even 7-year life cycle, you're always looking for the KOLs in their probably, before their first 2-3 years to get the most value. Just to give you an example, here is also a top tier fashion Weibo account over the past 4 years. So you can sort of see that sometimes there's plateauing, right? So this is a household name. Many people know this person. And the question is, where are they taking their audience? Is the audience moving to WeChat in this example, where they very successfully moved many of their followers into a platform? So I'd love to see the data in a year from now of how KOLs have moved their audiences to live streaming. Right? We'd love to see how that transitions over because many KOLs don't necessarily make that transition. So, and the other thing we noticed when we were doing these campaigns is that the same KOL doesn't always have the same results the second time around. It's typically less, unless their fans are growing dramatically faster than when you did the first project with them. So at the end of the day, it's a constant, ongoing campaign management system that you really need. And looking at it from perspective of 5 years or more, right? And the hard part about this is if you think about your marketing teams, your social PR managers who are working with these KOLs, what is their optimal relationship with the KOL is probably at least 2 or 3 years, right? Having hired many millennials and marketers in China, it's hard, 2 years at even one company is considered a very long time, right? So aligning, making sure that your goals and your relationship with the KOLs are aligned with just not just the people, but your whole organization. And just to recap, also de-risking with data helps you work with the rising stars better, right? It is very time consuming to run even a campaign with 10 KOLs. That could be 50 or 60 execution hours. And so, if you have the right partners and the right technology, you can improve that dramatically and actually build a system where you can work with KOLs on an ongoing basis. Okay. Thank you.